Welcome back. So we're moving right along here to part 2 of this lesson 6. And here we're going to take our second look at poetry this quarter, this time at the specific genre of poetry that we call dramatic poetry. What exactly is that? Well, we'll see on the next slide. And for this, we're going to look at the poem Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson from the mid-19th century, the Victorian period, in literary history. The reason I've chosen Tennyson's poem, because there are a number of dramatic poems I could choose, is that in this poem, he takes on the persona, the character of Odysseus from the Odyssey in Latin rather than Greek. Odysseus' name is Ulysses. So that's where the title from the poem comes. And the way Tennyson does this is a very specific poetic technique that clearly makes this dramatic poetry. But part of that technique is specific context. And in this context, we have Tennyson, if you will, imagining what Odysseus would be like as an old man, right? You have that journey. In the Odyssey, right, the journey is more important than the destination. Tennyson says, what would the destination be like? He asks that question. So he imagines, the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus regains his throne. So he imagines what it would be like if Odysseus had been ruling for years in that position he strived to return to regain. But if he'd been ruling in that position for years, what would he be like as an old man, very old, actually close to his deathbed? And so this kind of persona, this kind of character, is a really exemplary feature of the genre of dramatic poetry. But we've also read the Odyssey in here. So it gives us a chance to wonder the same question and see if we agree with Tennyson's take on that question of what would Odysseus or Ulysses be like as an old man who'd been ruling for a long time, a man who had fulfilled the destiny he was supposedly striving to achieve all throughout this very classic, very epic poem. So we can try to answer that question too and see if we agree with Tennyson or not. And I think that will make this lesson really fun. So that's one of the reasons why I've chosen this text and plotted the course the way I have. But let's talk about Tennyson, who he was, and then more importantly, dramatic poetry. What exactly, more specifically than I've said so far, dramatic poetry is, why we're studying it, how it fits into our larger study of genre we're undertaking in this class. All right, so a little bit of background on Tennyson, because you might not know who he is. And he was writing at a time, the Victorian period, where to study that particular period, if you do it, the historical context is probably more important than any other literary period you could study. I know that's a bold statement, and as I've argued several times in this course, historical context is always important, but the Victorian society in which Tennyson lived and wrote was an incredibly complex period of history, and the writers in that period, one of the things that marks that literary movement, they chose to really, more thoroughly probably than any other group of writers, engage with the social context around them. And Charles Dickens would have been one of his contemporaries. So if you've read any Dickens and you see the conscience-activating treatment of the working class in Dickens's writing, you probably get, just an example, you probably get what I'm saying here. So let's take a little bit of a look at Tennyson and what was going on in the Victorian world around him so that we can understand what he's doing with the poem Ulysses and why that's so specific and unique and profound. So from 1850 onward, he was the most popular Victorian poet, and the Victorian period lasted from roughly, or approximately 1832, passing of the first Reform Bill. Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, and then she passed in 1901. So roughly those little over 70 years there we consider the Victorian period. A little bit on him growing up. Despite drunkenness, Tennyson's father instructed him in classical and modern languages. So he had this, Greek and Roman Latin background that would have helped him really understand the character of Ulysses. He was encouraged by gifted undergraduates at Cambridge to pursue poetry, and they were kind of like a little club of writers that called themselves the Apostles. And so, despite maybe some what for others might have been hindrances growing up in his family background, he was able to get an education, and that specific set of circumstances propelled him forward to basically eventually becoming the Victorian Poet Laureate. His most important friendship was with the leader of this kind of writing club they had in college, and his name was Arthur Hallam, and he died at a very young age. So Tennyson's arguably most famous poem is called In Memoriam, AHH, because those were Arthur Hallam's initials, and it's about dealing with loss. And Tennyson composed it around the same time as Darwin published his famous work on the origin of species. And the Victorian period is known in part for the crisis of faith many writers and prominent individuals experienced because of a number of things, but primarily Darwin's work. And so, with a friend dying at a very young age, well before his time, what we would normally think of the time someone should go in their old age, Tennyson grappled with this, struggled with this, and worked through his own questions, kind of in the face of evolution. Like if we're confronted with the idea that the world might be meaningless, that it might all be survival of the fittest, how do I make sense of my friend's death at a young age? It's a very powerful poem for that reason. It's a very long poem. It's well worth reading, but that gives you some insight to who Tennyson is. It has some famous lines in it, such as, "It is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all," which is frequently quoted, as you know, by people, and often in a romantic context, where really he was talking about platonic friendship. So that's kind of an interesting fact, but I'm just trying to take a minute and give you a glimpse into who this man was before we read his poem that fits into our study of genre. His early volumes of poetry were published in 1830 and 32. Right at the start of the Victorian period, they received negative reviews. It took him a while to get his footing before he'd go on to rise to popularity in the 50s and eventually become Poet Laureate. His 1842 volume, though, marked the start of that leap forward. And like I said, he succeeded William Wordsworth from the Romantic period, who was Poet Laureate. And you might be thinking Victorian, Romantic, it's hard to keep all this straight. I have a slide coming up in a minute where I'll go over these different literary movements and how they fit into our study of genre and kind of remind you of the main guiding principle of each one. So stay tuned for that. He was finally successful enough from his poetry to marry Emily Silwood in 1850. So a little bit of his personal background, and that's significant because this period, the mid-19th century, we have studied work from here when we studied Hawthorne and Poe, but they were U.S. writers rather than British writers. But you get a sense of kind of what the world was like at that time from when we read Hawthorne and Poe. And what's significant here is that they were writing fiction, which in the next probably 10 to 20 years, the 1860s and 70s, fiction would eventually overtake poetry as the most popular genre because the middle and working classes became educated. They learned to read. The literacy rates in the populations in the U.S. and Britain and other parts of Europe skyrocketed. And what people who had never been able to read before, like the middle and working classes, wanted to read was fiction rather than poetry. And that's why in our first study of Fiction 1, a few weeks ago, we studied Hawthorne and Poe at this time. But up till the mid-19th century, poetry had been the most popular and dominant form because, that was what the upper classes liked. And so whereas Hawthorne and Poe kind of had to struggle to make ends meet, and Hawthorne had to work in a transcendentalist commune, which he didn't agree with their beliefs, but he worked there to make money. And Poe had to write all these reviews and other things to get by because they were writing fiction, and they were about 20 years ahead of when fiction would eventually become a source of income, and you'd have writers like Dickens who became wealthy from it. Tennyson's writing kind of the end of the reign of poetry as the popular form, and so he was able, once he became Poet Laureate, to become financially secure enough to marry the person he wanted to marry, because that's how things worked back then. So you can see how this is important. Poetry and drama, the way they've changed and developed over time, fit into our study of genre, or cornerstones of it, really. He eventually, as poet laureate, as he became older, developed this persona that became famous, where he became a bigger man in his older age, and with this shaggy long beard, and wore this cloak and a broad-brimmed hat, gruff in manner, booming voice as he read his poetry. That's what most people think of with Tennyson as, the poet laureate. And the modern poets, the period after this, really disagreed with Victorian values and Tennyson's style of poetry, and so this image became almost like a caricature associated with him and with the Victorian period, as later poets kind of protested those ideas. It's probably more of a caricature than who he really was as a person, but it's important to understanding his reputation as he's such an important figure in literary history. Finally, his work, Idylls of the King, is a long, epic work that uses Arthurian legend to represent a civilization's rise and fall. And the Victorian period was when the British Empire was at its most prominent. Remember when we studied the Renaissance in our previous lecture, when we studied King Lear? From the Renaissance period, I talked about how Britain was this fairly new country that took on the Spanish Armada, and Spain was the world empire at that time. We're skipping ahead about 300 years here, a little more, and now Britain is the biggest empire in the history of the world. That's where the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, comes from. And about 100 years after this, it would collapse. But a common trope in Tennyson's writing is taking something old, a legend or a myth, and using it to speak to comment on the issues of the day. That's what he did in Idylls of the King, using Arthurian legend to engage with the Victorian Empire, and in Ulysses, the poem we're reading, using the myth of Odysseus and the Odyssey to engage with Victorian values. And his canon, his work is so robust. So many great, interesting poems and long poems, like Idylls of the King and In Memoriam, that I wanted to give you kind of a sense of his oeuvre here. Helpful to know who Tennyson is and how he fits in as a significant figure in literary history, but more importantly, we should talk about dramatic poetry. Why are we studying it? How is it important to our study of genre? So like I mentioned several times, you're probably getting tired of hearing this, but I think we can never have too many reminders because the human mind forgets things so easily. Studying 4 genres each this quarter, doing 3 studies in each one, looking progressively, chronologically at each one, how it's changed over time. So epic poetry was what was dominant in the ancient world. Lyric poetry is dominant today. Dramatic poetry has been around as long as both of them, has never really been dominant, but it's a bridge, essentially, between narrative and lyric poetry, because it has a lot of the elements of narrative poetry, but not all of them, and a lot of the elements of lyric poetry, but not all of them. So it'll be a nice bridge for us as we do our 3-pronged study of poetry here. So what is it? Well, I said it had some stuff in common with narrative poetry. So like narrative poetry, it has a narrative. So it's not full-on lyric poetry yet. Lyric poetry is what you think of with like Emily Dickinson or William Blake, with these short poems about like a flower or a bird. Narrative poetry hasn't gone full-on to that sense. Lyric poetry just deals with a subject. It doesn't tell a narrative. So dramatic poetry still tells a story, like narrative poetry. But rather than being this big, sweeping piece with a large cast of characters like the Iliad or the Odyssey, it is usually like a scene, almost more like a short story, almost like flash fiction, but in poetry form. And there's usually a persona of a character who is like the speaker, giving forth their narrative. So that's dramatic poetry in a nutshell. A little more depth. Narrative poetry possesses many of the features of fiction. I'm doing kind of a comparison here between narrative and dramatic poetry, such as exposition and frequently an omniscient narrator, like in the Odyssey. But on the other hand, dramatic poetry begins en media res in the middle and focuses on a single subject like lyric poetry. So the Odyssey is complex, right? It's like reading a Dickens novel where there's all these layers, all these different characters weaving together. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have like a Dickinson poem where it's, just describing, for instance, a bird or a flower or something, and just dealing with that subject very briefly in like 16 lines. Dramatic poetry is in the middle of those two. It starts in the middle, narratively speaking, and like lyric poetry, it focuses on a single subject. What's happening in this particular scene? For instance, we have the perfect example here. Tennyson's not retelling the entire story of the narrative of the Odyssey. He's imagining just one scene. What would it be like Ulysses as an old man? So it's one scene, one subject, but it still has a narrative. It still has characters. So it's like I said, a bridge. It's combining these elements of both narrative and lyric poetry. Now, the Victorian period is really the best period to study with dramatic poetry because one of Tennyson's contemporaries, Robert Browning, invented a specific subgenre of dramatic poetry called the dramatic monologue. And it's really probably, you could say, the best well-known form of dramatic poetry, and Tennyson's Ulysses is a prime example of it. So these first few bullet points were to give you an idea of what dramatic poetry is. These next few are to give you a glimpse of the specific genre within dramatic poetry, dramatic monologue. Ulysses belongs to that genre. So one, a dramatic monologue is a poem that presents itself as the speech of a created character or historical or literary figure. So it's like a monologue, right? It's a speech by one character rather than a sweeping narrative, even though it has a narrative to it. And that character is usually invented for the specific purpose, the specific context, or it's taking a figure from history for the specific purpose, specific context. So in this case, Tennyson wanted to make a specific point. He found Ulysses from the Odyssey as a means and example to do that. The dramatic monologue often separates the speaker and the poet in such a way that the reader must work through the words of the speaker to understand the meaning of the poet. So when you have you always, hopefully I mentioned this in our first lecture on poetry, lesson 2, but with poetry, you can never assume, as obvious as it may seem, that the speaker of the poem and the poet who composed the poem are the same person. They often are, and in some cases that'll be made explicitly clear, but we are never to make that assumption as readers and analyzers of poetry, because the poet may be intentionally creating some distance between themselves and the speaker, and maybe choosing a specific speaker for a specific purpose to illustrate a point. And so that's a basic principle for all poetry, all genres of poetry, but it's applied to an even greater degree with the dramatic monologue. Because the character giving the monologue is a specific invented type of a figure, there's intentionally a great distance in most cases, some exceptions, but in most cases, between the speaker and the poet. To give an example, Robert Browning, Tennyson's contemporary who invented the dramatic monologue, would often use speakers who took the opposite view that he held. For instance, there's 2 of his most famous poems are about murder. One is called Porphyria's Lover, and the other is called My Last Duchess. And Porphyria's Lover, the crazy person, Porphyria's lover murders Porphyria when they're supposed to have their romantic rendezvous. And at the end, the speaker rejects Jesus Christ. And so it would be easy to read that and think, oh, Browning was experiencing a crisis of faith, like many of his Victorian contemporaries. But in actuality, Browning was one of the only Victorians who never, at least publicly, experienced a crisis of faith. And the title of the collection that contains Porphyria's Lover is called Voices from the Madhouse. So we have to realize, he's not taking the side of the murderer here, right? He's using the murderer to illustrate a point. But the only way we can know that is if we look at the context, right? The title of the volume of poetry. And so dramatic monologues make interpretation very complex. You may not be like me, but if you're like me, I love a challenge when I'm interpreting literature. And so I love this kind of poetry, although I understand it's not everybody's cup of tea. I get that. But I love that challenge of having to take the context and use it to interpret a poem that may be the meaning's intentionally obscure because of the speaker's very intentional, or the poet's very intentional choice of speaker. Browning has another poem about a real duke who murdered his wife, and he uses it essentially. The duke is the speaker in the poem My Last Duchess, and he uses it to really cast a very pointed and poignant critique of the biased and unfair gender roles during the Victorian period. And so it's kind of almost like a romantic gesture to his wife. And so there's this couple examples here to illustrate this distance between speaker and poet in the dramatic monologue. For instance, we have to ask the questions here, and we will in a minute. Does Tennyson agree with what Ulysses is saying in the poem? Because he may not, and that may be why Tennyson chose the genre of dramatic monologue. Now, I say all of that, but there's always an exception. There are other cases. There's an example of Browning's wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, wrote a poem called Mother and Poet that's about an Italian woman who, like her, was a mother and a poet, and whose sons died in a war in Italy, and she's lamenting the loss of them. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in her own life, because of her medical background, her and Robert did eventually have a child, but it was a challenge and whatnot medically, and so it's a very personal rather than distant connection between her and the speaker of that dramatic monologue. But that's an exception. So we'll explore both the standard and the exception in our study of Ulysses here. But I want to make you aware of the genre as a whole and just recommend some good reads to you. Finally, the dramatic monologue asks us to interpret what the poet thinks of the created character. So building on this previous point, you have a created character. The speaker may not, or the poet may not agree with the speech of that character. So asking us to interpret what the poet thinks of the character eventually gets us to the meaning. Like, for instance, in Porphyria's Lover, Browning thinks the atheistic killer is insane. Or in My Last Duchess, he thinks this duke who is insecure and murders his wives out of petty jealousy is a horrible, despicable person, and takes these historical things to make a commentary on what was happening at the time, because he saw, the way women were treated in this very patriarchal society. So, that's the genre of dramatic monologue. That's how it builds a bridge from narrative to lyric poetry. That's why I think it's brilliant. Let's take a look at an example in So as we study an example of this dramatic monologue, what are the threads or themes we'll pull on with Ulysses? You may want to pause here and look at your notes or jot down some threads you'd like to study. Again, as always, if we were in the classroom, I'd write them on the board and then ask you, which ones do you want to study? But here we are. One of the things I found is Tennyson utilizes the very familiar character of Ulysses or Odysseus to provide a commentary on the issues of his day. So, dramatic monologue, invented speaker from the past, using that specific speaker in context to make a commentary on the issues of the day. It's easier to make a commentary on the issues of the day, without getting any repercussions for it, if you create some distance. So that'd be one of the purposes of the dramatic monologue. Like if you were Browning and you're going to question the patriarchy, easier to do that and still maintain your reputation if only the most detailed of readers pick up on the subtle message you're conveying through these complicated layers of context. So similarly, Tennyson utilizes Ulysses from mythology to comment on the issues of the day. But I said historical context was so important to this study for this reason. So what were the issues of the day? Like I mentioned, Tennyson wrote during the Victorian period. And we've now studied a good number of literary periods or literary movements. So let's recap what they are. And I'm going to try to use just one word to sum up each one so that we move through these quickly. So antiquity, the ancient works. The first 2 weeks we read works from ancient Greece. In the previous lesson, lesson 4, we studied the Renaissance, Shakespeare's King Lear specifically, and some of the focuses there were individuality, new discoveries, and with that individuality, psychology, or the focus on the interior mind. Couldn't do the Renaissance in one word. The next ones I will. So in between antiquity and the Renaissance was the medieval period or the Middle Ages. We didn't really read anything in this class from that period because we can only cover so much. And the purpose of the class isn't to give you a chronology of the literary periods. If you've taken English 273, hopefully you get that. But they are important to understanding genre, so we do have to discuss them some, which is what we're doing now. And from the Renaissance on forward, you can see more clearly how each period builds on and responds to the other one. So the Renaissance, encapsulated by King Lear. Next up was the Enlightenment, Sor reply, so just the first half of this lecture. And remember I said in the part one of this lecture, the Enlightenment writers emphasized reason above all else, rational thinking, but you can't just rationalize everything. So there was always this repressed emotion beneath the surface, which you see very clearly in Sor reply. So the Renaissance, and with the new scientific discoveries in the Renaissance, you can see how out of that the Enlightenment grew to emphasize reason. So the Renaissance, Enlightenment with reason. The Romantic period, which we haven't really studied after the Enlightenment, those repressed emotions burst through to the surface. So you've got Renaissance, individuality, new discovery. The Enlightenment, reason above all else, repressed emotion, Romanticism, emotion, imagination to the surface. And of course, similarly, just how the Romantics responded to the Enlightenment writers, the Victorians responded to Romanticism. So they're like, let's put a cap on the emotion. And we're going to focus on duty, morality, the building of the empire. And I think that's what makes the Victorian period one of the most interesting ones to study, because you see how Britain engaged with the rest of the world, and in a period of so much moral tightening up, how various writers responded to those constraints and contexts. So you have, as the issues of the day for Tennyson, to come back to our first thread, you have coming out of the Romantic period, this emphasis on duty, morality, empire. How does Tennyson engage with that? Well, Ulysses depicts that tension. It really depicts the tension between emotion or imagination and duty. So that tension between doing what you want to do, what you feel like you should do, and doing what you believe or society tells you is right to do. And that's a tough one, right? Because if we just give into our emotions all the time, my experience is they lead to pretty disastrous results. But we shouldn't just accept everything blindly. We should question things too. So I think even though this poem deals with a really specific context from a specific time period, the question at the center is a universal one. What do we do with the tension between what we want to do, what we feel like doing, and what we know we should do? Sometimes the two line up, not always. Sometimes they push each other, and sometimes one is right, the other is right. So Tennyson can help us figure this out. I want to give you that cultural context. And so that's the first kind of thread, is tension between emotion and duty. What are some other threads? So one is looking at this specifically as a dramatic monologue. So the distance between speaker and poet, the beliefs and values of each are also at tension. How does Tennyson use the tropes of the genre, specifically the distance between speaker and poet here? So thread one, emotion versus duty. Thread two, distance between speaker and poet. Thread three, metafiction. Ulysses imagines what Odysseus would be like as an old man after ruling in Ithaca for years. So it's really fun. I love metafiction, being able to engage with imagining what would this character be like after the text where they're originally presented. So tension between reason and or emotion and duty, distance between speaker and poet, imagining what Odysseus would be like as an old man. These are all great questions to ask. What does Tennyson say about emotion versus duty? What is the distance between the speaker and the poet? How does that convey the message? Do we agree or not with the depiction of Ulysses as an old man? Finally, Ulysses is relatively short poetry. So most dramatic poems are short enough that they demand we use unique and specific reading strategies to grasp their meaning. Ulysses presents the first of two opportunities we'll have to do this. So, with the Odyssey, we tried to look for the poetry in it, but for the most part, it was hard to find because it was one, narrative poetry, and two, moreover, in translation. So even though it was technically poetry, we basically read it like a novel. Dramatic poetry is in between narrative and lyric poetry. So if we read dramatic poetry the way we're supposed to read lyric poetry, it'll take a long time because they tend to be not epic poems, but longer than lyric poems. But if we don't take that time, the meaning might escape us because the meaning is not straightforward the way it is in narrative poetry. So we're going to get a glimpse here of how to read shorter, more obscure poetry, and in lesson 9 we'll do that more fully where we finally have our study of lyric poetry. So here are my tips for reading dramatic and lyric poetry, because reading short dramatic or lyric poetry is very different from reading long epic poetry, which in translation reads more like a novel than a poem. So for short poetry, read the poem once at a normal pace to get a feel for the language. Read the poem again, but out loud and slowly to get a feel for the rhythm. Try to paraphrase in your own words what each line of the poem means by making notes in the margins. Read your paraphrase of the poem. Read the poem out loud, slowly, after reading your paraphrase. So to pause here and discuss these a little. So this might be a lot of work with Ulysses, so I don't necessarily expect you to do this with Ulysses. With the very short lyric poetry we read in lesson 9, I will ask you to do this. But I would ask you here to do it with at least a passage, 10 or 12 lines or something, so you can get a feel for it. Because poetry is so inaccessible, so challenging. Students often are not a fan of poetry, and I was not a fan of poetry when I was an undergrad. But in grad school, to get through grad school, I had to learn how to read poetry, and now I absolutely love it. So if you can do these steps, you can understand poetry, even though you may think you can't, and that will lead to such a profound, delightful experience for you. So with any short poem that's obscure in its meaning, I suggest reading it at least 3 times, reading it once, just getting through it the way you'd read anything else to get a feel for it. Read it again slowly, this time maybe pausing where there's periods or commas to kind of get a feel for the sound of it, the rhythm of it. Sound and rhythm are very important in poetry. And then poetry, especially obscure lyric or dramatic poetry, is almost like another language because it uses poetic language. And in lesson 9, we'll talk about things like metaphor and personification that are specific to poetry. But because of the poetic language, it's almost like another language. So after those first 2 readings, try to mark in the margins what you think each line means. Like translate the poem essentially from poetic language to straightforward language. Then kind of read through, look through your paraphrase, and after you've struggled through it, struggled to paraphrase in your own words, read it one more time so that now that you've kind of figured out the meaning, you do it again with that meaning in mind, but with the sound, the language, the rhythm again. Finally, after those 3 readings and after the attempts to paraphrase in between the second and third readings, try to sum up the entire poem in just one or a few sentences to get a sense of its unity. So if you've done a line-by-line paraphrase, that's amazing. That's awesome. You're going to understand the poem better, but it might feel a bit cluttered. So try to say in one sense, what is the meaning or essence of this poem? And then, as you should with any literary work, ask, now that you've summed up the poem in one sentence, what is significant or meaningful about that poem? What does it teach us? What do we learn from it? Why should we read it? The so what question. So that's how you read poetry. Again, we'll really practice this in lesson 9. I'd like you to just try to get a taste of it here so that you're getting your feet wet with poetry. And one of your discussion board options will be to do this with a short passage from Ulysses. Turn now and actually interpret the poem. So to get at the character of Ulysses and how Tennyson is interpreting him here, I first ask, how would you characterize Ulysses' tone at the start of the poem? And so I'd read aloud, It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth, among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. Some famous lines here. Love the sound of them. What is the meaning of them? Ulysses experiences melancholic isolation among the tedium of ruling. So I think what Tennyson is getting after here is that Ulysses or Odysseus is maybe not a great king, maybe not fit to be king, right? The Odyssey, we said, was about the journey more so than the destination. Here's the destination. He has to dole out laws. He was not meant to be an administrator. So in this sense, I think it fits somewhat with the original text. But a thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind is, do we like this guy? He calls Penelope an aged wife, and he calls the people over whom he rules a savage race. I don't really like this guy yet. Do you? And moving on, I said there was this tension between romanticism or emotion and Victorianism or duty in the poem. So let's first look at emotion, the romantic perspective. And the next number of lines right after the opening lines, to me, really represent a romantic perspective. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that love me and alone on shore, and when through scudding drifts the rainy Hades vex the dim sea. I am become a name. Again, these great famous lines that sound beautiful, but what do they mean? He wants to be out there having an adventure, drinking life to the lees on the high sea. Remember that phrase, vex the dim sea, repeated throughout the Odyssey. He's borrowing it here to say that's where Odysseus, as hard as that was, he was in his moment there. And he says, I am become a name. So now he's quoting the Odyssey here, but it's Odysseus saying that's all he is now. He's become a name. He's king of Ithaca, but he's not, slaying monsters. And that's a very romantic perspective to answer the question, because these are his feelings, his emotions, and he's seeming to want to give in to them here. So he's not really tempering that at all with his duty to his people. A very Victorian kind of a question. So if Ulysses represents the romantic perspective, I would argue that his son, Telemachus, represents the Victorian perspective. Why? Well, later in the poem, he says, this is my son, my own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter in the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. So, if you think back to the Odyssey, right, Telemachus was a boy becoming a man while Odysseus was gone, and he was doing the kinds of things a leader does, administering to the people, while Odysseus was gone. So in many ways, then, Telemachus is a better fit to be king, right? He's made up his mind. He's leaving, right, to go out on one last hurrah. So he's leaving the scepter in the isle to Telemachus. But he's softened a bit toward his people. Instead of calling them savage, now he's calling them rugged, probably because he's ready to look forward to his adventure. He's a little more calm here in terms of his attitude to his present condition, since he knows it's about to change. But he says that Telemachus can subdue them to the useful and the good. So a kinder way to say that might be channeling their energy well. Odysseus isn't an administrator. He doesn't know how to lead his people, how to help them do good, but Telemachus can. So, to talk about our third thread and connect it to our second thread, dramatic monologue genre, to connect to our first thread, romantic and Victorian tension, here you have the distance between Tennyson and the speaker, right? Tennyson probably doesn't really agree with Ulysses, right? We've seen how he doesn't present him as a great guy, and he has not gotten much better here. And then, his son, who doesn't even speak in the poem, who he just talks about in passing, is a better fit to rule. So Ulysses is the romantic here, and Telemachus is the Victorian. People who could lead others to the useful and the good, direct their energy, to be administrators. Those are the kinds of people who thrived in Victorian society. The rugged adventurers were not really Victorian men, put it that way. So finally, what is the distance between Tennyson and Ulysses? And I love the final lines of the poem. The very final line is so famous: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So it's really interesting because this is, again, the romantic perspective, like going out on this grand adventure on the seas where he's probably going to die, right? He's like 90 years old, and he's going to go out and, sail around the Mediterranean and fight monsters again. So he's like sailing with his men here to certain death, but he'd rather strive to seek, to find, and not to yield than continue and sit on the throne and dole out laws to a savage race. So it's a very romantic perspective, and it seems like Tennyson would disagree with that, right? Being the Victorian poet laureate championing morality and duty. But what's interesting is these lines became famous as a model for Victorian work ethic and energy. So to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, in your duty is how the people reading it at the time interpreted it, rather than to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield on the adventure that indulges your feelings. So the poem is kind of operating on two levels. We can see on the one hand, Ulysses represents this very romantic viewpoint that Tennyson and his contemporaries wanted to do away with, but at the same time, the energy associated with that perspective could be channeled into the things they did believe in and agree with. But so you could call that romantic drive, that energy of the imagination channeled into Victorian duty, into a less imaginative pursuit. So the poem operates on two levels in this way, but all of it is Tennyson taking this character we and his readers know so well from mythology and using him for an entirely different purpose. But is it untrue to Ulysses' character just because he's being made into like a Victorian ideal here? Does that mean that Ulysses would have been a good king, that he wouldn't have gone out on one last adventure to meet his fate on the dim vexed sea? See what you think. So for the discussion board, that's the first thing is this romantic Victorian tension. So explain how Tennyson represents romantic emotion and imagination and the tension between that with Victorian morality and duty. You can think specifically how Ulysses represents romanticism and Telemachus represents Victorianism. Which view do you believe Tennyson endorses? And how does the distance between the speaker and the poet in the dramatic monologue help Tennyson express his endorsement of a specific view? So basically that first thread, we've talked about it a lot already, but I think there's plenty more you can still do with it. Second thread, second question. With dramatic monologues, poets do not always utilize the potential distance between themselves and their created characters. A poet may invent or depict a specific character in a dramatic monologue for a variety of reasons. Can you find a theme or idea expressed by Ulysses in the poem that you think Tennyson would actually endorse? Why do you think Tennyson would agree with that specific idea? Why do you think he chose to put it in the mouth of Ulysses? So here, kind of a different take on thread 2. So question 1 actually brings threads 1 and 2 together, because question 1 asks, what is the tension between romantics and Victorians? How does the genre of dramatic monologue help Tennyson depict that? Thread 2 asks you to flip, or question 2 asks you to take thread 2 in a different direction. So where is there less distance between Tennyson and Ulysses? I gave that example of the Barrett Browning poem Mother and Poem, where the speakers actually very much like the poet. Might be hard to find here, but I'm asking try. See if you can find a glimpse of that. Where is maybe a part where Tennyson agrees with Ulysses rather than disagree with him? Thirdly, engaging with the metafiction here, which I love. Thread 3 was metafiction. So Do you agree? Is this what Odysseus would be like as an old man or not? I personally think, in the Odyssey, the journey is more important than the destination. I personally think Odysseus probably would be with bored with the destination and not good at it, so he wants to get back to the journey. But I've taught this poem a lot of times, and I've had students say, no, he wanted to get home to be there. He fought for 20 years to be there. He's going to want to be there with Penelope and his people, even after a long time. And I think that's a legitimate argument you can make. So I'd love to see you do. You don't have to write a poem for this question, or you could, but how would you do Odysseus as an old man? We've seen how Tennyson would do it. How would you do it? Finally, the thread 4 was learning how to read short poetry with an obscure meaning. The meaning isn't too obscure here, but it's certainly more obscure than it was in the Odyssey. So how do we do that? So if you're not happy with any of these first 3 questions, you want to do question 4, you would pick a short passage from the poem, again, like 10 or 12 lines, and you would use that passage to to do like a short lyric poetry reading. So pick like 10 or 12 lines, any section you want, and go through these steps. Read it once to get a feel for it. Read it more slowly to get a feel for the sound, the rhythm. Try to paraphrase it in your own words. Read your paraphrase, get a sense of what it means, then read those lines again so you really know what they mean, some of their meaning in a sentence, and then why is that meaning important. So how do you do this on the discussion board? You don't have to do every line of your poem on of the passage you picked on the discussion board, but you should have some identify. You don't have to quote them either because it'll take up space, but say what the lines are. You can quote them for your classmates if you want, but at least say what the lines are, and then you got to do 250 words after those lines. So you can summarize the poem and say why it's meaningful in 250 words. However you want to do that, you don't have to do it line by line, but you can. No matter what, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think of this poem.